One of the global threats to the natural environment systems is the climate change challenge. And in 2015, the global community agreed in Paris to limit carbon emissions so that the temperature rise could be restricted to well below 2 degrees centigrade. Many countries have since pledged to achieve net zero emissions by a certain target date, say by 2050. As the world prepares for recovery from the pandemic, this is an opportunity to build back better through clean, green, and sustainable development options. So we have a lineup of four presentations today. Four speakers will share their speed lectures, and there will be a question and answer session after that. So our opening talk will be given by Dr. Rupert Gammon from Montfort University, who will highlight the role of sustainable energies in this agenda. As a major contributor to global greenhouse emissions, energy supply and use will have to transform significantly by the maybe 2050 or around that time. So Rupert will share his thoughts about how sustainable energy options can play a role in the transformation. So I pass it on to Rupert now.
Thank you, Subhes. I hope you can all hear me. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so one of the major issues in the climate change situation is around transportation, mobility, and how we can decarbonize the whole transport sector. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the title of my talk is Sustainable Energy for a Net Zero Journey. So here are a range of ways of traveling. Down in the bottom left corner there, some ways of traveling without creating any emissions that I'm sure you are quite aware of. So if you're walking or running or cycling or even rowing a boat, you are using muscle power and you're producing no emissions. And equally, muscle power can come from animals, and so for centuries we've been using horses and donkeys and oxes and so on. So all that I'm sure you know about. Obviously, you probably know about how we have harnessed renewable energy in the form of wind for many centuries to drive sail boats and ships. So these we're all very familiar with, and these are journeys that are taken without any greenhouse gas emissions being used to power that journey. What is changing now is that we're now starting to look at how we can do such journeys in modern vehicles like cars, trucks, lorries, buses, trains, etc. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And so I'll bring your attention to the top of the slide, particularly that sort of yellowish box. You will see two main pathways there. These are energy pathways, starting from the energy put into the system to the delivery of the service at the end of the system. And if you're going to have a zero emission journey, obviously the energy that fuels that journey has to be zero emission in the first place. So we start off with a clean energy source, which I'm assuming is wind or solar or some other renewable energy source. It could be nuclear. It could even be fossil fuels, as long as they have carbon capture and storage involved to remove the carbon dioxide emissions from the from the environment. But for the moment, I would not worry too much about that, because we haven't really proven that technology. So broadly speaking, when I'm talking about clean energy sources, I'm really talking about renewables here. So that energy is fed into the electricity grid, and then if you've got a battery electric vehicle, of course, you plug that into the electricity grid to recharge. And on the other hand, if you have something like a fuel cell vehicle, then the electricity goes into an electrolyzer, which produces hydrogen fuel by electrolysis, and then that hydrogen fuel goes into the fuel cell, and you're on a fuel cell electric vehicle. Now, the difference between those two is really about the distance and the carrying, the weight of the load. So for short to medium distances and relatively light loads, just a simple battery electric vehicle is a good option. But when you get to longer distances and heavier loads, we have to start thinking about fuel cells. It's still an electric vehicle, but the fuel cell gives it a longer range. And that's why we need the hydrogen for that. But just like the recharging, the energy for making that hydrogen can come from the electricity grid. The option that's sort of hanging out at the bottom of that that box is one I don't really want to go into too much detail about, but that's for very long distances and very heavy loads, and that's things like planes and ships, where you combine the hydrogen that you may have made by electrolysis with some kind of biological fuel to make a synthetic jet fuel or a synthetic sort of equivalent of the kind of fuel that's used on a ship. But that's kind of a little bit far off in the future at the moment. We know how to do this, but demonstrations of that are pretty rare still. So we'll park that for now and think about that later. Right now, I want to concentrate on things that are pretty familiar to us, like cars and trains and buses. So that's why I'm looking at those two mobility services and the routes to them, the energy routes to them, in this box at the top. Now, so that all sounds very good. We can get our nice clean energy, it goes onto the grid, and we either recharge our electric vehicle or we make hydrogen, and that can go into a fuel cell vehicle. Sounds simple enough, but of course, I'm sure you're all aware that the grid isn't as clean as that there is, as well as all the renewables coming in, and it's an increasing amount year on year, we are still using a lot of fossil fuels as well. So so to make sure our journey is as clean as possible, as zero emission as possible, or as close to it as possible, what makes a real difference is when you recharge your car or when you turn on your electrolyzer. And a way of us making use of that sort of difference in carbon footprint at different times is to have an electricity tariff that responds to that difference. So generally speaking, when there's lots of renewables coming into the system, the supply is plentiful, and therefore the price for buying electricity on the market is relatively cheap. At the moment, you as an ordinary customer don't really see that difference. But in future, we're talking about sort of tariffs, and there are one or two companies just starting to introduce this, the tariffs that respond to that variation in the sort of wholesale market price and pass that on to the customer. These are called time of use tariffs. So you could imagine that at times when there's lots of renewables coming in, the price will be cheap, and that will incentivize you to plug in your electric car and recharge at a time when the cost is much lower. And if you're a electrolyzer operator making hydrogen fuel, again, you will switch on your electrolyzer to take advantage of that cheap electricity tariff. And then when the times are that maybe it's cloudy, so you're not getting the solar energy, the wind has dropped, so you're not getting the wind power, then more fossil fuel is brought in to fill that gap. And that is more expensive. And of course, that makes the grid electricity have a higher carbon footprint compared to when it was being powered largely by renewables. That is the time that your time of use tariff will get more expensive. And that obviously discourages you, disincentivizes you to recharge your electric vehicle at that time, or to run your electrolyzer to make hydrogen at that time. So there is a relatively simple pricing mechanism whereby not only are you responding to the availability of electricity, but that availability of renewables obviously coincides with the cleanness of the carbon footprint of the electricity that you're plugging into. We are not yet at a point where that is a very clear correlation, but as we get more renewables onto the grid and less fossil fuel, and as the market matures, there will be a strong correlation between price and carbon footprint. And this is something that has many terminologies, but I tend to call it demand shaping. People also call it demand side management or demand side response. But anyway, what you're doing is you're shaping the demand to match the availability of the supply, which is the opposite way around to what we do today. And that also helps you to get a cleaner carbon footprint for whatever services you're using, whether it's mobility or heating or any other use you're getting for your electricity. And of course, what this does, by making use of all these electric vehicles with all their onboard batteries, you're doing a electricity storage job for the grid without the grid having to buy up enormous sheds full of batteries to do that job for itself. So this makes the whole system much more efficient. It cuts down on the amount of hardware that the system requires. And the thing with hydrogen is it does this on a much larger scale and can do it over a longer time scale. So as weather systems move across the UK, actually trying to capture that renewable energy and then use it later tends to happen over time periods of about a week or two, and hydrogen can cope with that, whereas recharging your car, putting off that recharging for a couple of days until the wind comes or whatever, you can do that with a car, but it's only a couple of days. So the great thing about hydrogen, it gives you that longer term control over the balance of supply and demand. So what this does is create a fantastic symbiosis between a low carbon transport sector and a low carbon power sector. So the low carbon power is fed into vehicles so that they're providing low carbon transport services. But at the same time, they are also, because of this ability to time shift the charging or the making of the hydrogen, and this effectively acting as storage, this allows the grid to take on board even more new renewables and to gradually get rid of its reliance on fossil fuels. So in other words, the electric vehicle and hydrogen vehicles are actually helping the grid to decarbonize. And the grid is obviously decarbonizing the transport sector by providing the electricity for it to run on. And this creates a feedback loop that over the coming years and decades is going to spiral up and up and up to eventually a completely zero emission energy supply chain from beginning to end. Now, that is going to take place over time, but I have been involved in research which has managed to put this entirely into place already. And this is a research project I've done in which the electric vehicle is powered entirely by solar energy. So this is, we believe, Africa's first solar-powered taxi service. It is the taxi is an electric vehicle that is plugged into a completely standalone solar-powered mini grid. So this is a completely off-grid community, and there are many of these in Africa and across the global south. So when it's not busy being a taxi, when it's parked up and resting, it's also recharging, and it's recharging from the roof of its garage, its carport, which is entirely made of photovoltaic panels. Now, as this is a little mini grid, it actually benefits really a lot from one, having a nice big commercial load, which is the taxi, but also a load that can be time shifted in that way that I was describing a couple of slides back. So if the electric vehicle plugs in while the sun's shining, then the energy doesn't have to be stored in the mini grid's own stationary batteries. That means the stationary batteries that all these mini grids have doesn't have to be really huge, because a lot of that storage is taking place on board the vehicle. So that makes the mini grid cheaper, because a lot of the storage is actually being done on board the vehicle. And that vehicle is paying a good income into the mini grid operator's business, because it takes quite a lot of energy. But that taxi driver then earns money on that. So it's a really good business model for all concerned, and it makes the whole system cheaper and more reliable. And it cuts down on pollution. There's no fuel cost. Electric vehicles are really well suited to Africa, and they're very low maintenance. And when their batteries sort of start to degrade after about 10 years of use, you can take them out of the vehicle and use them as the stationary battery for the mini grid. So there's a second life value in the batteries as well. And all this promotes local jobs and services and skills, and is creating new market sectors for some of the world's poorest people. So this is fantastic for lifting people out of poverty. So what I love about this is not only are we doing that, helping some really disadvantaged people, Africa is in a position to show the so-called developed world how this can really be done, and can actually lead the way. And so I find this a very exciting project, and it shows that this really can be done. And what we're looking to do is to spread this out much more widely. And on that positive note, I shall end. I shall just close my screen down. There you go.
Thank you, Rupert, for your interesting presentation. We will take questions at the end, so please hold on to your questions. And yeah, once we finish the other presentations, we will come back to Rupert if you have got any questions. Now we move to the next talk, which is on cities. Now, cities, they play an important role globally, both in terms of economic impacts as well as for climate change. Almost half of the world population globally, they're living in cities nowadays. They consume about 2/3 of world's energy, and cities contribute around 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So efforts of cities in the transition process that would play an important role in our efforts towards net zero transition. And this is the topic that would be now discussed and presented by Dr. Leticia Ozawa Almeida and Dr. Birgit Painter of the Montfort University. So a transition to net zero would be heavily dependent on how resources would be used in the cities, and that's what they would be, and aligning it with the sustainable development goals. So they will talk about this now. So Leticia and Birgit now, please.
Hello, thank you very much, Subhes, for the presentation, introduction. Well, we'll introduce first ourselves. I am Leticia Ozawa Almeida and Dr. Birgit Painter, and we will both talk about the transition to net zero cities. We are trying to deliver this presentation with a little twist. So we want to deal with the transition to net zero cities in a more holistic manner. So how the climate action can integrate with sustainable development goals. As Subhes mentioned earlier, it's quite important to focus in cities. Cities are drivers of economic growth. They create jobs. They also building infrastructure, but at the same time, they are very hungry in resources. And this is the picture now, as Subhes already mentioned, but we can expect that in 2050, it will the urban population will increase up to 70%, which means around 9.2 billion people. And we are also expecting a huge increase in energy demand. And that's so important, why it's so important that we concentrate in trying to reduce these emissions. However, I think most of the times when we talk about net zero, we usually focus on mainly energy, but we don't tend to forget that we also use, well, partially also use energy for mobilization, as Rupert mentioned earlier, but we also have embodied emissions in the buildings that we live or work, also in the emissions from the supply of electricity, for example, and other fossil fuels. And also in the goods and services that we consume, like clothes, food, and also, for example, in the waste that we generate. But not all is bad news. I think cities are already taking action towards reducing their emissions. And we can see in different sectors, in the building sector, energy, industry, transport, waste, and also in the land use and forestry. So yes, well, I will not go into much detail on these different areas where the sectors are reducing their emissions, but we already know some of them. Increasing energy efficiency is very important. Also, Rupert mentioned issues about smart grids as well as transport. And in the next presentation, Rafi will talk also about circular economy and waste. But it's also important to remember our green spaces in our cities, which make our life nicer. And when we talk about climate action, there is two ways of tackle climate change. One of them is reducing the emissions, which we call climate mitigation, but it's also important that we become more resilient to the impacts of climate change, which refers to adaptation. And when we try to address the Sustainable Development Goal 13, SDG 13, we also tend to focus on SDG 7 related with affordable and clean energy. We also try to make things, our cities more resource efficient, like with SDG 12, with more responsible consumption and production. And we also should not forget an essential resource of life, which is water, SDG 6 with clean water and sanitation. And our own well-being is also important, as well as the sustainability of the communities with SDG 13 and SDG 3 and SDG 11. However, Rupert mentioned very rightly, if we do or conduct or try to address climate change in the best way possible, these SDGs are all interlinked. And by addressing the reduction of emissions, we can also create a decent work, we can reduce inequalities, we can reduce poverty. And yes, and I think in this case, I will pass to Birgit to explain more about our project. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Letitia. So yeah, if we want to understand really how cities respond to climate change, to the net zero challenge, we thought actually look at the holistic picture, like Letitia said, would be interesting, and actually see how different cities link their climate action and other activities to the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, as a whole. So we've got this project called Sdg Capacities, where we kind of compared UK cities in UK and in Japan. Obviously, you would want to compare cities all over the place, but this was a starting point to work out a way where we might be able to, how we might be able to do this. You know, compare different cities and how they align themselves with Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea was to develop a framework that can then be applied to other cities, and just generally to have a look what's happening across the world and what the different options are that cities have, so they can actually learn from each other as well. And obviously, as we always like as researchers, you know, build a network, do some, you know, exchanges. So that was part of the project as well. But as I say, we looked at UK and Japanese cities. So if I introduce the cities we looked at, there was 2 cities in Japan. You've probably heard of at least one of them. Obviously, these cities are very large. So we got Kyoto and Kawasaki. They're very large cities. They actually, interestingly, one is located in a coastal area. So Kawasaki is more of a coastal city, and Kyoto is more inland. So that gives an interesting comparison already, because there will be different challenges for the cities. Kyoto has a very varied economy, whereas Kawasaki is more manufacturing kind of base. So there's a lot of industry there. So again, it just provides different challenges. And obviously Kyoto, you've heard of from the Kyoto Protocol, but also Kawasaki has an eco-town project and various track record really in this area. And for the UK cities, we looked at Bristol and Nottingham. So they're obviously, as you can see straight away, they're a lot smaller, but actually also have that interesting comparison between a landlocked city and one on the coast. The economic activities are quite varied in both, but also both have been lighthouse cities on EU smart city projects. So they both have track record in kind of looking at how the city responds, what the city challenges are, and how they can be kind of, you know, what steps can be taken, and really integrating with integrating the different parts of the city much better, making use of technology, but also looking at the citizens. Certainly the Bristol EU project was looking at the integration with citizens and technology, whereas Nottingham was particularly focused on energy efficiency, so on a retrofit project. So it gives them a slightly different approach, but they both have a strong track record. So we thought they were quite interesting cities to look at. But how do you do that then? So obviously all these cities you've probably heard of, you know, the different, you have climate change action plans, and they have usually have an economic plan. They have all sorts of different plans, and it can be quite difficult to compare the cities. So we actually chose the because we wanted to see how the cities' plans link to the Sustainable Development Goals. We picked the Climate Change Action Plan, or the closest document we could find. Also, we looked at various documents and then picked the most recent and relevant one. And we compared them, and we thought we wanted a quick snapshot really to find a simple way of comparing the cities, at least initially, that we can then apply to lots of cities and get an overview of what's happening. So we used a text, excuse me, a text analysis tool. So first we developed a taxonomy of keywords for the SDGs. So for each Sustainable Development Goals, we chose certain keywords, and then we used NVivo to do a text analysis and just see how closely, how often these words came up, and then from that infer how closely the link was being made within the document. So this example there is a chart that we were then able to produce for Kyoto. I'm not sure how close this will be on your screens, but so we don't need to understand all of, what each rectangle is there, but the brown one I can say is the energy, so it's SDG 7. So that seems to be the strongest for Kyoto, the strongest link, the SDG that was most closely linked to their climate change action plan, which makes sense. And in terms of the net zero we're talking about today, actually kind of it's good to see that is acknowledged. But also other SDGs were quite prevalent. So the purple one is business, so that's strong economic growth and fair work or something. I forget what the exact name is. And then the green one is SDG 13. That's the climate change, so climate action SDG. So that has adaptation and mitigation to climate change. So that's where Kyoto focuses, seemingly from the document we looked at, where their focus lies. So with this approach, I say it doesn't at this point just give us much detail, but it allows us to compare cities. So if we now go to the next slide, we can compare the kind of the same chart for Kawasaki to the Kyoto one. So again, the brown one, the SDG 7, is quite strong. The business and economic growth is important. They focus less on the mitigation to climate change. I forget now what the red one is. I used to, on my screen, I used to be able to see it a bit bigger, but also, yeah, that's talking about water management and also about industry. So this is how the cities, the two Japanese cities look like. So do you think, oh, they're quite similar perhaps? But if you then compare it to the UK cities, I'm sorry, it gets smaller still, but hopefully we can get some impressions of what we can see. So as we can see, Nottingham actually doesn't have the energy SDG 7 as their main one, but their main ones that got the most matches was the SDG 11, so that's sustainable development. So they're really focusing on sustainable development more widely in the region. They do have energy there, which links to their smart city project as well. And then the yellow SDG 12 is a responsible consumption and production. So that's then looking at waste and resource management as well. And if we look at Bristol, it has a very different pattern again. Really, they're important. They really frame it around resilience and adaptation to climate change. So climate change action is their main focus. But they also, again, mention business and sustainable development and the circular economy in terms of the production and consumption. So it's quite interesting when you compare those. We thought, oh, can we find another way of looking at the chart? The data in more detail. And sorry, I was just clicking on my own display. So we have a bar chart to compare as well, which might kind of highlight some of these comparisons a bit more. So again, we can see that SDG 7, they've all identified that as quite important, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. The UK cities, so the orange and red, seem to be more focused on have a clearer link there to sustainable cities and communities, and also to the responsible consumption and production. What's interesting is that numerous, SDGs that get low scores, that's quite similar in the 4 cities. I mean, for some of them, it is not very unexpected. For example, gender equality is quite, but what was not mentioned at all in terms of our keywords. But obviously, the idea was this was their climate action plan, so maybe that link wasn't necessarily that obvious. But certainly so there are some differences in terms of the net zero topic we talk about today. It's good to see that energy is being recognized, that The consumption and production is mentioned as well. And industry, the UK cities seem to have a bit more on the identifying partnerships as important as well. So that was quite interesting. But of course, what is really important is that we acknowledge the differences between the cities, their different challenges they experience, also their different strengths, and that's what comes out just even from this brief analysis. So we kind of understand the limitations of this approach, but it allows us a quick snapshot and a comparison. But of course, to understand more clearly what the different considerations are that the cities have. There was a second part to the project, and Letitia will tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, I think that we wanted to go a little bit deeper in what is the opportunities and barriers of the local authorities, not only for local climate action, but also for integrating the Sustainable Development Goals. So therefore, we prepared a questionnaire that it was distributed online between July and September 2020. We tried to distribute it to 40 municipalities and also local authority networks, like local government associations or climate networks. But unfortunately, we only received 8 responses. And I think that the main reason was that at that time, in the summer 2020, we were in the first lockdown, and local authorities certainly needed to respond in a more urgent way to the COVID situation rather than answering a survey. However, these 8 responses, I think they are quite valuable. They bring up some insights of what they feel they were or perceive are the main opportunities and challenges. Hopefully you can see also the pie charts in the right-hand side, but overall we have like a balance responses between unitary authorities, county and district councils, and also from one London borough. And also the distribution, the responses came mainly from East and West Midlands, but we also have some responses from the North and South of England. So firstly, talking about the enabling factors or barriers for local climate action, you can see, I will try to explain this slide. For example, the ones that are in green are the ones that we can consider like enabling factors. The ones that are in yellow are kind of neutral, neither support, neither is a barrier for local climate action, while the red are what they consider possibly substantial barriers. So if we can see in this graph that one of the things that are enabling factor is the political will. There isn't enough local support from politicians in the decision making for climate action. Also, I think there have been a lot of work in the UK local authorities with community engagement. So the communities know about climate change, how to reduce their emissions, and they have been well engaged in this pathway. Information doesn't seem to be a problem, perhaps a little bit for some and not really for others. And this means information about emissions data, also about modeling tools. However, if we go to the other side for the barriers, I think that perhaps having not only local authorities, but also in a lot of large institutions. So some of the barriers perceived in red by the respondents was the conflict with other budget priorities. Also, the staff time availability. You can see in the graph that staff expertise is okay. They have knowledge and experience of dealing with climate mitigation and adaptation, but it's more this staff time. So perhaps, it's low availability of human resources and their time. And also, the first one at the top, it was action or inaction from central government, but in this case, because it's in red, we can consider that is mainly from the inaction part. So also talking a little bit about the integration of Sustainable Development Goals, we also asked them what they feel are the opportunities and the challenges. Within the opportunities, I think we can agree that addressing the different sustainable development goals have co-benefits that can be produced at a lower cost or with enhanced impacts. It's also, they also recognize that different SDGs are interlinked, so those synergies can also be helpful. In the red, going to the extreme, they also feel that there is kind of a complexity between the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the targets. Well, in the climate action, perhaps is very well dealt with sustainability and environmental departments, but for sustainable development goals, you need a more wider participation from different stakeholders as well as from departments within the councils. Overall, they don't feel that there is a barrier. It's perhaps feasible to work with different departments as well as involving different stakeholders. And there is somehow more or less availability of the information for the different sustainable development goals related with economic, social, or environmental data. However, we also ask them about to what extent they implement the sustainable development goals at the local level and if they monitor those activities. I didn't present this graph. It was almost all in red. But one of the things that they mentioned that are done in a very limited manner is to integrate or introduce these SDGs in the Council's policy framework and also develop a set of more localized indicators specific to the Council that they haven't collected or monitored them. And in contrast with what's happened with climate change, there has been less communication on the engagement, so more of the general public knows about the Sustainable Development Goals. And with this slide, I will pass it again to Birgit for our concluding slide.
Okay, thanks, Leticia. So yes, we kind of, with this presentation, wanted to give you an overview of what cities are doing and how we might understand, how different cities go about integrating SDGs, and obviously with a look to net zero as well. So from even just a small analysis we've done, we can see that SDG integration can take many forms. The text analysis can provide us a snapshot, but actually a far more detailed kind of delving into the documents and actually talking to the different stakeholders is needed to really understand what cities are doing and what their limitations and enabling factors are as well. What we certainly found even from this was that adapting the local actions to adapting the action plans to local situations and the challenges is crucial to make them really, to come up with effective solutions. So while cities can learn from each other, it's certainly important to engage with the local stakeholders to make things really effective and ensure that the implementation can actually progress. And one thing I wanted to kind of mention, often when we think about net zero, people think it's just energy. We're just talking about energy, but actually energy is just one part. And we've seen this in the mapping of the SDGs. Energy is one part. It's an important part, but it's only one part of the climate, the city's action in terms of climate change, and also then to really help them on their journey to net zero. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leticia and Birgit, for your excellent presentation. And I must mention that part of the presentation would be published in a paper soon, which is undergoing revision, and we are submitting a revised version of the paper, which hopefully will be accepted. So this is very, very recent research that they have presented, and even the survey data has not been presented elsewhere as well. So this is very hot outcome that they have presented here. Now, the next topic that next speaker will focus on another important aspect, which is about circular economy. circular economy approaches towards net zero, because the net zero solutions that we are aiming at um, would require returning back to the resources that we are using to the nature, so that we are not creating and damaging the environment. So from that angle, circular economy approaches would be very, very useful and helpful in terms of delivering net zero outcomes. Professor Rafael Avila of the Montfort University will present now the circular economy approaches to net zero, highlighting the case of waste to energy. I hand it over to Rafaela now.
Thank you. I think, okay. I think, I think Letitia or, okay. Yeah. Okay, can you see my presentation, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so thank you for the nice presentation. Yes, so what I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes is the basic of the circular economy, and in particular, because I'm interested in the organic part of the, on the biological part of the, I will touch on some of them. And what I like to provide you also is a little bit of a reality check on what we are doing currently, which is not circular, and the very little things that we could do to improve that circularity. So here I'm going to, this is our target, the Paris Agreement target, and using the word of Dame Ellen MacArthur, switching to renewable, and that's what Letitia and Birgit have said. Switching to renewable energy plays a vital role in addressing climate change, but this alone will not be enough. In order to achieve targets on climate, it is critical that we transform the way in which we design, make, and also use products and food, not only products. So a recent report from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is one of the, Dame MacArthur is one of the major promoter of the circular economy in the UK, but worldwide as well. A recent report from the foundation, in collaboration with Material Economics, found that moving to renewable across the globe will only address 55% of the greenhouse gas emission targets that we have committed to. To achieve the remaining, we need really to promote other measures, such as further scale up renewable energy efficiency, like the one that Rupert described in his first presentation, reforestation, carbon capture and storage, or climate smart agriculture. So those are some of the examples that we need to implement. But more important, and in kind of you will see why in a kind of a easy way, the circular economy, where we rethink the way in which we use, as I said, we make, design, make, and use all products and food. So the circular economy concept, if you've never heard of it, is actually quite an intuitive concept. So the idea is that to introduce cycles into products and material, like the cycles that we found in nature, like the nitrogen cycle in nature, or the carbon cycle and the water cycle. We have all heard about the water cycle. So the idea is that to recreate those cycles into the way we produce materials. And yes, okay, easy said than done, Rafi. And how do we do it? So the idea is that we will have two cycles, two flows of this material. One is the called technical material, where the material are more durable, where we got high quality and added value material, which are designed to circulate but not enter the biosphere. So I'm pointing into my little graph to a television, for example, or a car. So these are high value product that we could design and use in a different way. And then we got the more sort of the biological flow, which is more the consumable flow, where the material are biodegradable. And that's where I'm working, the area where I'm working, and where we kind of, food is one example, but we can think also about textile, not man-made textile, by natural textile, or any product that is made of wood, for example. So that can be reintroduced into the biosphere and help building that natural capital. So these are the two flows, and you probably have come across this graph before. The graph is really an easy way of representing what the circular economy concept is all about. Is underpinned by three principles. So preserve and enhance natural capital by controlling finite stocks, optimize resource by circulating products and components and material, the highest utility. And I know I'm explaining what I mean in a minute. And then the third principle is foster system effectiveness by designing out negativities. And again, it's basically by designing things that are not linear anymore. We're not going down the discharge anymore. So, the highest utility, the cycle with the highest utility. So you can see there's different cycles, especially on the right hand side, on the blue side, where the technical sides, I call it, and the smaller the circle, the higher is the value. So and the better it is for that product or that material. And I'm sure you can read the first circle say share. So if I can give you an example, in an ideal world, most of our car sits on our drive. We have most of us in the developed world, we have more than one car. And one of the car probably sits on the drive for a long time, unused. So that's not a very good use of our material. Is not very good use of the product. So that sharing is an alternative way of using that product. We then go further in the cycles, and obviously as we go further, wider in the cycle, we lose that the value, and to the point where we do recycle, which is still a very a circular process, but obviously we have probably to input energy in doing that. So that's the negative of that. You can say, how do you do that? How do you translate that into the green one? And obviously there are ways. And when this was designed was probably a few years back. That concept of sharing, maintaining, reuse for the technical side was quite sort of intuitive. It's less intuitive, obviously, on the biological side, but sharing can happen, kitchen sharing can happen, it would be nice to have sometimes I have stuff at home that I would like to share with other people, but that concept is not there yet. I used to do it when we were a student in a student accommodation, and people would lend each other stuff, and share stuff, and that's really a concept that would be nice to be reintroduced. That's that a way of optimizing the biological side. And you can see then there's another sort of extraction of biochemical and feedstock, and I'll explain a little bit more later on, and biogas, and that then all that material can then go back into the biosphere and rebuild the natural capital. So how does that link to waste management, and why do you want to talk about waste management? Well, I think I've got to kind of I like to highlight that the waste hierarchy that was introduced by the waste directive, by a European waste directive, is actually very close to the circular economy in terms that there's a different option highlighted into this hierarchy, and the most favorite one is the reduction, which is what we are trying to achieve with the circular economy. Reuse, recycle, recover, and landfill is actually, or sort of incineration, that's or energy from waste, is the least favored option. So it's very much, we have been told to do that for a long time. Obviously, that only touches one portion of the thinking, the systemic thinking of the circular economy. But is been the waste hierarchy has been around for at least the last 15 years. So we should be a little bit ahead of where we are, and I'll show you where we are. Okay, so at the moment, and this is data from a couple of years ago. I couldn't find any more updated one. At the moment, worldwide, we extract each year about 60 billion tons of raw material. Okay, so it's a lot, but doesn't mean a lot to us. 22 kilos per person per day. That is actually closer to to make you understand how much we extract every day. Is a lot. Is probably about a third of me every day in waste. So it's quite a lot. So 50% cannot be recycled because 50% is fossil fuel that we burn or food that we eat. A lot of it goes into what we call long-term stock in terms of their construction minerals that are, sort of embedded into buildings, for example. But a lot of it is in the product that we use, every day, like cars, refrigeration, personal care products, and a lot of it will not be recycled. It will not be included into a circular process. 60% of it actually goes still to landfill, and this is a shocking number if you think about the fact that the waste hierarchy has been there for a while. So again, I dug out this data a couple of years ago. I tried to dig out an updated one, but is really difficult to find our waste data. This is actually all waste. So before I show you the whole extraction, the amount of material extracted, this is all waste. So it's municipal waste, so our household waste, commercial and industrial waste, manufacturing, but also construction waste. in Europe, 47% of all waste goes to landfill. In US is a little bit higher. A little bit, incineration is a little bit higher, both in Europe and US now, but not much. And on average, we only recycle about 35%. So it's actually, we are really far away from circularity. So going back to what Letitia and Birgit have said, energy renewable is important, but can we do a little bit, sooner through our proper waste management? So again, just to bring it a little bit to home, I know that probably we have a bit of, I hope we have an international audience, but if we haven't, we are discharging about 8 kilos per person per day of waste. And that's obviously including all type of waste, so also commercial, and this is on average. So we extract 22 kilos and we discharge 8 kilos. It's quite a lot. We're not circular at all. So we got a long way to go if we want to achieve our targets. And again, just because this is close to my heart, is the food waste. And food waste is actually a massive problem. And there's I call it the paradox, because when we talk about food waste, people think about, okay, yeah, so I'm putting something in the bin. It's not a lot, Rafi. It's not much. However, 30% of what we put in the bin is actually never been even opened. So we have got a very, very bad record in the UK. So 30% is never eaten. So it's perfectly, just food that has been rotting into the fridge. But to produce that food, we have used about 250 million liters of water. Is a huge amount of water. And we have used 300 million barrels of oil, and we spend 750 million to do that. So is not just about the food, it's about everything that has been inputted into producing that food. So if I just to give you an idea how big this problem is, if we put those emissions, these are worldwide. I'm back to worldwide emission. Okay, if we are putting that emission into a we turn that food. Sorry, if we turn that food waste into emissions, and we put them into a scale and compare to emission from countries, food waste would be the third most polluting country after China and the US. So this is easy. This is something that we can do, and we don't need anything from, we can just be a little bit more mindful in how we purchase the food, how we use our food, and be a bit more aware of the waste that we produce. Just quickly, I think I'm overrunning, so apologies. The two square that I kind of highlighted in the graph, the one that are on the biological side, we said about closer cycle, sharing, for example, but there's other things that, for example, is the work that I'm doing in the Montfort, for example, is the extraction and fermentation of these materials, so that we can start, instead of throwing away this material, some of which will be inevitable. We will have always a little bit of waste. into waste biorefinery, where the material can be used to produce chemicals and avoid some of that, fossil fuel dependence. And also, the waste could be put into anaerobic digestion, which is a process by which we produce biogas and a biofertilizer. So just briefly, this is an example of what I work on. By anaerobic digestion, I get organic waste or any agricultural waste, any waste, sludge as well. We ferment it in absence of oxygen in anaerobic conditions, and we produce biogas. And the remaining of what is in the fermenter, once the biogas has been removed, is a biofertilizer. But this is good. This is good, Rafi. Yeah? Yes, it is. But actually, we can do more. And what I'm working on is adding value to can we do smaller cycle rather than anaerobic digestion? Can we do extraction from some of this material? Can we do production of chemical from this material, but also from the biogas, for example? We've done a project on growing larvae on digestate, and the larvae can be used for animal feed, for example. So there's a lot of other circles that can be added into this process that is relatively simple. So I hope I haven't scared you, but let's try to be more mindful of what we do with our waste and our products, and that will definitely help achieving our net zero.
Okay, thank you, Rafi, for your interesting presentation. Now we have the final presentation. This is about governance of net zero. We have talked about various aspects, technological aspects, role of cities and waste management. Now, how all of those things could be put together, that is important. And we have Dr. Catherine Reitegg from Newcastle University. She was with us before, but now she is in Newcastle. She will present this aspect of governance of net zero. So hand it over to Catherine, please now.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, also for having me here. So my talk is going to, kind of zoom out from all the interesting approaches we have already heard and actual solutions to the climate crisis and how we can address the big problem. Next slide, please. So the climate crisis is really upon us. We've seen it, we see it anytime we switch on the news, especially before COVID hit. We see wildfires, we see floods, droughts, hurricanes, and if you think this is far away from the UK, think again. In the recent years, we've come pretty close to hurricanes turning east side and actually hitting Ireland and the UK, and we're going to see even more of those challenges in the future. Next slide, please. So we have this final big push, which seemed back in 2014-15 close to impossible to achieve after the failed negotiations in 2009 in Copenhagen, to have this big global post-Kyoto agreement that would actually help us to effectively address climate change, because until the Paris Agreement, it was only developed countries which have caused climate change whose responsibility it is to clean it up and to address it. But as the world develops, as China turned into a major economy, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, many other countries, the emissions of the developed countries are going to increasingly going down, and we do need the help of the developed countries to actually address climate change. So what we have seen happening there is, with the Paris Agreement, it is the first one which actually does include developing countries, but also with the promise to help and to support sustainable development and the decoupling of the economy so that countries can have economic and social growth while at the same time addressing climate change. So essentially not repeating the fossil fuel problems the development of the today industrialized countries has caused. So the Paris Agreement sets a 1.5 to 2 degree target of warming in response to the plight also especially of small island states in countries with low-lying populated areas to not sacrifice them as sea levels rise in the 2 degree centigrade scenarios that have been kind of the target which countries were working towards initially. And as of 2019, just to give you an idea of how close we actually are to this 1.5 to 2 degree target, the observed global temperature change has already been in the range of 0.8 to 1.2 degrees, so an average of 1 degree. So we are very close and time is definitely running out. Next slide, please. So this means that, and this is a major improvement, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, where countries have recognized that they do need to reduce emissions, and the Fridays for Future movement and others have had a very important role to actually bring climate change back up on the international agenda, because for a while it really was in danger of dropping off and being sidelined by all the big crises we have been facing around the economy, around Brexit, and all kinds of global crises around migration, for example. So climate change is back on the political agenda. That's the good news. And countries have increasingly started to recognize the importance that their initial targets are not enough. We are on a 3 degree, 4 degree warming pathway, but we really need to move towards this 1.5 degree target to actually save low-lying island states, big populated river deltas, and to really avoid the worst effects of climate change, because we will have to adapt, but there is still time to avoid the worst consequences. So this means that decarbonization of the economies needs to happen before 2050. So moving towards those often called net negative emissions, which essentially means that we need to compensate remaining emissions with carbon sinks such as trees, and also increasingly questions around carbon capture and storage. So for most countries, we need, well, everyone needs interim targets, because 2050, that's almost 30 years away. So this means interim targets of reducing emissions by about 50% within the next 10 years. And this is a massive challenge, considering that most countries, the UK, Germany, many other developed countries within the Kyoto Protocol, managed to reduce their emissions by 20 to 30% in the last 30 years. So we need a 50, well, we really need to step up over the next 10 years to meet those targets. So this really means major shifts to the economy and large-scale investments, and also an increased recognition by governments of the crucial role which is played by cities, as we've seen from the previous presentation, but also businesses and civil society. Next slide, please. So the two wedge diagrams you've seen on the previous slide and on the current slide, they really show how the global trends are growing. So we see the current trends, which is the red line, which means, gigaton carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase. But with the policy scenario from a global perspective, we might just have a continuous level, but not necessarily a reduction. So this means that all those economic sectors you've heard the presentations about before, they really need to play together. It all needs to come together. We need 100% renewable energies, renewable electricity. We need to think about how to reduce emissions in transport. Cities are one of the major sources of energy and all other emission type consumptions. The building sector is a massive emission causer, and so on. But in the end, the sustainable development scenario, as things add up, we are still essentially above the emission target, in the sense that there will be emissions which will not go away, and most of them are in agriculture, methane, land use changes, and so on. And and some residual transport energy, carbon dioxide emissions. So this means that we really need to have some kind of compensation around ideally planting trees, which are the best carbon sink, and other aspects as well. Next slide, please. So one example of a nationally determined contribution, which is essentially countries under the Paris Agreement having committed to reduce their emissions, is from the United Kingdom. And overall, we need policy measures towards net zero emissions. And there are a number of factors that need to be met for them to actually work. And this means that they need to be socially inclusive, need to focus on economic co-benefits such as green jobs, zero carbon investment in infrastructure and technologies. They need to be based on a reliable cross-party consensus to ensure that there is trust in long-term investments for transport and energy infrastructure. And this is incredibly important because, as we've seen in the United States, if there's no cross-party consensus, the next party comes into government, does away with all the climate change commitments, can even exit the Paris Agreement, and then there is a strong disincentive for investment, because most of those investment cycles run between 10, 20, 30, even more years, if you think of power and all kinds of electricity infrastructure, for example. So, and on the other hand, the environmental, social, and economic costs of carbon emissions also really need to be reflected in the prices, and fossil fuel subsidies essentially need to be phased out as soon as possible. And within this overall scenario, the United Kingdom was among the first to establish a legally binding climate change legislation through the 2008 Climate Change Act, which was 2 years ago in 2019 amended to net zero by 2050. So what does that actually mean? So the UK has, like many other countries in Europe and Japan, for example, as well, other developed countries, has been developing climate change legislation and policies over the last 20 years or so. Most of them emerged in the early 2000s. One of them was also the 2006 Climate Change Program. We set up different institutions, the Department for Energy and Climate Change, which has been merged into the Business Department, and also the Climate Change Committee, and increasingly the business community is also picking up. And the old target of about 10, 12 years ago, which was to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, has now been replaced by reducing emissions by essentially 100%. And what we see here is, this is a first step up. The UK was actually the first country to do this in focusing on net zero emissions, and other major economies have followed suit. We have the European Green Deal from the European Union. The Biden administration has announced that they're also looking for a net zero target by 2050. Japan has made similar announcements. Even China has now committed to a net zero by 2060 target. So quickly going away from the earlier, much less ambitious and more business as usual targets. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different policy instruments how we can actually achieve this. Command and control regulation is probably the best known and still the most common one. It sets rules that are backed up by monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, as governments command the regulated parties to behave in a certain way by setting, for example, emission standards for air pollutants, product standards, mandating the use of specific technologies, or also setting up low emission zones in cities. Then we have market-based instruments, which are becoming increasingly important because they put a price on carbon emissions and essentially polluting through emissions trading. The cap and trade system is a very good example of that, but also having positive subsidies or removing negative fossil fuel subsidies and moving towards carbon taxes. And then a final big element, like the ISO 14001 standards, are voluntary agreements in the form of public-private or private partnerships and industry-set standards. So those are looking at allowing more flexible approaches to leverage resources of non-state actors, but they do run the risk of deteriorating into greenwash or PR campaigns with limited effectiveness. So they really need monitoring and third-party verification through independent organizations, for example, the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and also international NGOs. Next slide, please. So to close this emission gap, we also need to look towards new technologies to scale up. Smart cities, smart grids, the Internet of Things are really on the rise, and also the question of how we can actually use them to advance addressing climate change. And this is really where there is a lack of policies at the moment, and a big vacuum and almost a big experimentation going on. There are large challenges for social cohesion in terms of employment, privacy, cybersecurity, and also unintended outcomes for democracy, and potentially even increasing emissions because it becomes easier for fossil fuel industries to extract resources. So this really requires policies that minimize all those risks, and especially with regards to personal data protection, we've made some progress there, which is the area with the strongest progress, but also there are still big questions around privacy, cybersecurity, and social policies around education. Next slide, please. So this means that maintaining public support needs ensuring socially inclusive transitions. There will be losers of this transition, and it's very important to have strong social policies in place to address that. We're going to see a lot of divestment from fossil fuel resources, which also means that people's pension funds, which are currently invested into those sectors, are going to suffer. We will need to cut fossil fuel subsidies, and a lot of this means job losses. And a socially just transition is really central that retrains for the new green jobs. On the other hand, there is a big promise that investment is picking up and that a lot of millions of new green jobs are going to be created through this. Next slide, please. So to conclude, there are a lot of benefits, but also there are inevitable challenges that need to be addressed through public policies and legislation to maintain this public support in a very socially inclusive transition. Because if we don't take everyone along, we get the kind of backlash that we've seen in the United States of the 2016 election, for example, and the rise of populism as well. So we need to take a holistic approach, which is based on the Sustainable Development Goals and international cooperation. And where a lot of my research is how we can improve mutual learning and capacity building between countries and across countries and within them. And this all will be very crucial. So countries can ensure successful also COVID-19 recoveries through low and zero carbon economic transitions. And the key point is that there needs to be policy stability, so investment security over the different time spans by embedding those climate policies across the different sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. That was very nice. And I think the main theme of just transition, that's very, very important for all of us, and it's very relevant for a net zero transition. I have not seen any questions or comments so far, but yeah, please feel free to send any questions or comments so that we can discuss them. I can direct them to the speakers. We have got 5 minutes left before we end, so please use the chat box to send your comments. And just to start the process, let me ask a question to Rupert. So Rupert, if you could highlight the issues maybe and the research challenges that might be existing in this area of sustainable energy pathways for a net zero transition.
The challenges
Yeah, so what kind of research challenges are there, and how maybe new researchers could be taking up, what challenges they could take up, what kind of projects they can take up?
Um, wow, that's a huge subject. I mean, you've only got to look through the list of 17 SDGs and see that everything there has, you know, every one of those 17 has in itself a range of areas in which you could do research. And I mean, the stuff that I've been doing is typically quite technical, and it's covered, you know, I suppose predominantly energy from energy production to grids, smart grids, obviously these days, and energy use. That could be in the heat sector, in the transport sector, or in the power sector itself. That's all huge. But in fact, you could argue that, you know, those three sectors cover everything, and obviously energy lies behind everything that we do. So there's all the technical stuff around that. But there is also the social and political, and this particularly this idea of the just transition. It's clear that we have to make this transition, but how we do it is critical, because this is not just about the sort of physical survival. It's about society itself. You know, that if we continue on this pathway to sort of climate crisis and ecosystem crisis, the outcomes for most people and most societies across most of the planet is going to be pretty serious. But those who are going to suffer the worst are the people who are already poor and disadvantaged. And there is a pretty direct correlation between how poor you are and how little you have contributed to the problem, and yet how poor you are and how much you're going to suffer from it. So the social side of it is huge as well. The politics, we can't get any of this to happen without behavior change at an individual level, at a corporate level, and at a political level. So, you know, there's all the non-technical stuff. There's buildings, there's infrastructures, there's, you know, I think, so I would in a way throw the question back and say, can you think of anywhere, any form of research that does not have to involve this at its core? In other words, every single human activity and whatever research you're carrying out has got to have this at the core, or else what on earth is it doing?
Yeah. Okay, we've got a question from Ian Johnstone. At a local level, what can community groups do to create change effectively? That is, charities, third sector, interfaces, etc. What should we focus on? Who would like to take this question, please?
Perhaps I can say something
Yeah,
about it. I am
yeah.
just trying to put my camera on, but it perhaps we also can be responded for different perspectives. I think, well, yeah, it's very difficult, the community engagement. But I think that one of the things that we need to consider is what's in the heart of those charities or those third sector interfaces, what is they are interested on. So, for example, there is a sustainability project that we are trying to do with Leicester, Nirvana Football Club, and I think also is how they understand sustainability, how they understand the net zero transition, and what can they do. I think it's important to ask them themselves what is important for them. Is it the waste? Is it the energy? Usually we go for the long hanging fruits, which are related with energy efficiency, change our lighting, but perhaps it's more effective when the initiative comes from them what is more important from them. And then there are several pieces that can be done, as Rafi said, about waste or energy, as Rupert said. That is my perspective. I hope it could answer partially your questions. I don't know if anybody else in the panel would like to add on it.
Okay, I think we'll end there because the time is running out already. Time has run out. So I would like to thank all the speakers for their participation and for their presentations. I think all of you have enjoyed this video, this presentation. All the presentations would be available through our YouTube channel. I would like to thank those who participated, who joined us for this event. So the audience, thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you will be able to join us again in our future events, which would be advertised subsequently. So thank you all, and I would also like to thank the events team who organized this and who managed the event from the background. So thank you again, and so we will stop here, and hopefully we will see you again in another event. Thank you.